It's not every day you wake up to the sound of a diesel engine choking on lake fog at 7 a.m. and find a tow truck reversing down a boat ramp with chains in its teeth like it's on a rescue mission from a Fast and Furious spin-off. Except this time, it wasn't a car being rescued. It was 2 fiberglass kayaks, my kayaks, dangling from the hooks like criminal contraband. I stood there in my slippers, holding my coffee, wondering if I was still dreaming or if HOA Karanet had finally gone off the deep end. The driver gave me a sheepish wave like he was just following orders. Meanwhile, Karanet Bloom stood off to the side, clipboard in hand, wearing a neon sash that read Lake Enforcement Volunteer while sipping cucumber water like this was her coronation. That was the moment I knew she had declared war. Not just on me but on logic itself. Let me backtrack slightly. My name's Eli, and this lake, Silverthorn Cove, isn't just where I live. It's where I work, breathe, kayak, and unwind. I inherited the land from my grandfather, a quiet man who spent his life restoring the ecosystem around this very body of water. Technically, I own the majority of the shoreline and the rights to the environmental operations tied to it. For most of my life here, things have been peaceful. Until last year when a new development popped up on the south end and brought with it the HOA from hell. Within 6 months they named Karanet president, and within 7 months, she was wearing that sash like it was stitched by royal decree. She started off small like they all do. Flyers about noise levels, polite reminders about trash bins, asking neighbors to consider painting their mailboxes in uniform colors for community aesthetic. I ignored most of it. Then came the rulebook. 37 pages. Single-spaced. Suddenly, the lake, my lake, was no longer just a peaceful patch of water. According to Karanet, it was a shared resource in need of aesthetic and safety regulation. She formed a 3-person lake use task force, appointed herself chair, and appointed her 2 most loyal subjects, Ron and Sheila, to oversee compliance. I didn't take them seriously until I saw them measuring paddle lengths and weighing fishing lines for code violations. At first, I thought it was funny. I'd watch from my porch as Ron tried to issue a citation to a 10-year-old kid for having an unapproved flotation device shaped like a flamingo. But the joke stopped being funny when they started enforcing bans. The signs went up overnight. No private kayaks allowed. No unauthorized vessels. No fishing off unregistered dock. They even held a ceremony to bless the new HOA-branded paddle boats, which looked like rejected props from a kid's water park. That was when I knew something darker was brewing beneath the surface. A few weeks later, it got personal. One of my clients, a retired Marine named Walter, had been using one of my kayaks for water therapy. The man has a prosthetic leg and a quiet soul, and the lake was his peace. He came to launch one morning, and was confronted by Ron and Sheila in matching polo shirts and visors, accusing him of trespassing with illegal equipment. I only found out because he called me, flustered and embarrassed. I apologized profusely, and as soon as he left, I walked to my dock and noticed my 2 bright orange kayaks were missing. At first, I thought maybe a storm had drifted them. But then I checked the security footage. The footage showed an HOA contractor arriving early that morning, unhooking the kayaks from my private dock, loading them onto a trailer, and hauling them away. No notice. No fine. Just gone. That's when I realized they had crossed a line they didn't even understand existed. I drove straight to the HOA office. The place looked like a spa lobby. Calming music. Candles. Air fresheners that smelled like citrus and passive aggression. Karanet was seated at the front desk behind a sign that read Community Peace Coordinator. I told her, flatly, that my kayaks had been stolen. She smiled, handed me a laminated pamphlet, and said they had been towed for violating Article 19 subsection C of the Lake Use Guidelines. When I told her I never signed those guidelines, she laughed and said my signature wasn't necessary. That the HOA had jurisdiction over lake access, and she was doing the community a favor by keeping it beautiful. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just stared at her like she had grown a third nostril. Then I thanked her, turned around, and walked out the door with the calm of a monk and the clarity of a man who now had reason to act. Because what she didn't know, what the entire HOA didn't know, was that this lake wasn't just water to me. It was a responsibility. And by messing with it, they hadn't just poked the bear. They'd stepped into the bear's cave and started repainting the walls. When I got back to my cabin, I opened a file I hadn't touched in years. My grandfather's conservation agreement with the state. It granted our family control over ecological maintenance, sediment testing, and floodgate regulation for the entire southern half of Silverthorne Cove. I made a call to Lupe, my friend and attorney who specialized in property rights and environmental law. I told her everything. She didn't laugh. She just said one sentence. Looks like it's time to remind them who actually owns the water. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines and the lake rippled in gentle silence, I walked down to the edge and ran my fingers along the faded markings of the old valve shed door. A plan was forming. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't threaten. I'd let the system speak. I'd give the HOA the maintenance notice of a lifetime. And by the time they realized what I'd done, it wouldn't be kayaks they'd be missing. It'd be the entire lake. I didn't sleep much that night. The plan echoed in my head with every creak of the cabin's walls and distant call of a night heron. It wasn't about revenge. At least, that's what I told myself. This was about balance. The lake had rules of its own, ancient ones. Nature didn't appreciate being micromanaged by committee and laminated signs. I woke up early, not with rage but with resolve, and brewed my coffee like it was a battle ritual. The sky was still bruised with dawn when I stepped out with the conservation agreement in one hand and my grandfather's maintenance blueprints in the other. The valve system was old but well built. My grandfather had designed it himself, back when the county wanted to turn this entire region into a reservoir but settled instead for private co-management with environmental oversight. He was one of the few voices who convinced them to preserve the area instead of paving it. The result was a rare thing in modern America, a privately managed lake with natural authority tethered to a family legacy. The small concrete hut hidden behind the reeds looked like a garden shed to most people. But beneath it sat a calibrated outflow system, designed to allow controlled water level management during drought, flood, or ecological intervention. That meant I had every right to lower the water level for maintenance, provided I filed a report with the Department of Water Resources, which I had done that morning while the HOA was still asleep in their matching bathrobes. Lupe called around 10. She had already sent the formal maintenance notification to the county, referencing the conservation clause that backed my authority. She even found language stating that lake access would need to be temporarily suspended during maintenance periods for safety. In short, I wasn't just in the right, I was bulletproof. Her tone on the call was equal parts amused and impressed. She told me she'd never had a client who weaponized ecological stewardship before. I told her I preferred the phrase responsibly recalibrated entitlement zones. She laughed and told me to keep receipts. I said I had security footage of the tow truck and she said, perfect. The next few hours were spent installing pump regulators and redirecting sediment flow channels. Most of this work could be done quietly with modern equipment. No diesel engines. No alarms. Just low, mechanical hums and the steady rhythm of gravity at work. By early afternoon, the first signs of the drawdown were visible if you knew where to look. A small line of wet silt formed where the lake had begun to recede by a few inches. Most people wouldn't notice for another day or two. But I kept working, checking monitors, adjusting flow gates, and documenting the process like it was a lab experiment. Which, in a way, it was. Later that afternoon, I returned to my porch and placed a simple wooden sign near the HOA walking trail that led to the lake. It read temporary ecological maintenance in progress, water levels subject to change. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted clarity. The sign even included a QR code that linked to the formal maintenance notice filed with the county. It was all legal, all within my rights, and all completely devastating to the HOA's delusional marina dreams. The first confrontation came faster than I expected. By sunset, Ron showed up with his usual scowl and his always too tight golf shirt, pointing at the sign and demanding an explanation. I offered him lemonade and gestured for him to scan the code. He did, muttering about jurisdiction and board meetings. When he read the document, his face shifted from red to pale, a reverse stoplight. He asked if Karanet knew. I told him she would soon enough. He left without finishing his lemonade. By the next morning, the lake had dropped another 6 inches. That might not sound like much, but it was enough to expose the base of the floating patio the HOA had installed for their weekend brunches. The support barrels beneath it were never properly anchored, and by mid-morning, the platform tilted at a sad angle, spilling its plastic chairs into the shallows. I watched from a distance as Sheila tried to gather the chairs using a pool skimmer and a lot of yelling. She eventually gave up and kicked the water in frustration, which mostly just splashed back at her. I got a text from Lupe later that day with a photo attached. It was a screenshot from a local Facebook group where someone had posted a picture of the shrinking lake and captioned it, "Is Silverthorne drying up or just being drained by drama?" The comments were pure gold. People speculated about sinkholes, secret mining operations, government experiments, and ancient curses. One person accused Elon Musk of terraforming the region. Another claimed it was revenge for a stolen flamingo floaty. I read through them while eating a sandwich and laughed harder than I had in weeks. But beneath the comedy was tension. I could feel it rising like steam under pressure. By the third day, the HOA board held an emergency meeting under the gazebo. Karanet arrived in full regalia, sash, clipboard, visor. I stayed at a distance, but I heard every word thanks to their brand new wireless speaker system that accidentally broadcast their conversation in all directions. She insisted the lake was being sabotaged. Ron tried to explain the permit. Sheila blamed the fish. When Karanet finally read the full document Lupe had provided, she went quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then she threw the clipboard onto the grass and declared it a conspiracy. That afternoon, a new sign appeared near the HOA office. "Attention residents. Unauthorized lake maintenance may be occurring, stay clear of equipment." I added a second sign below it with a printed county seal and my name, clarifying the legal grounds for the work. It didn't stop the whisper campaign, of course. That evening, a kid on a scooter sped by my house and shouted "drain thief" before losing balance and crashing into a bush. I helped him up and gave him a popsicle. He asked if I really controlled the whole lake. I told him not the whole thing, just the part that mattered when people forget what lakes are actually for. That night, as I watched the stars shimmer over the diminishing waterline, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. I loved that lake, every ripple and reed. But sometimes, nature needs room to breathe. And if draining it for maintenance also drained the egos that polluted its banks, so be it. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was just reminding everyone that the lake doesn't serve brunch. It serves balance. The lake looked like a retreating army. Water that once shimmered across wide, tranquil spans now slithered back from docks and boat ramps, leaving behind exposed mud, scattered reeds, and confused fish flopping in shallow pools. But this was no accident of nature. It was a methodical, controlled response, one Karanet still couldn't understand even as she stood at the lake's edge with her arms flailing and her voice screeching over the drone of my pumps. She called it sabotage. The rest of the community was starting to call it something else entirely. By the time the HOA's floating brunch patio had fully grounded itself into a crooked, muddy embarrassment, the tension had grown impossible to ignore. Residents who once paraded around in white boat shoes and linen caps were now stomping through the muck, their lifestyle luxury reduced to swampy chaos. Paddle boats were stuck in reed beds. The new HOA rental jet skis sat tilted on their trailers, useless without enough depth to even float. The brunch crew canceled 2 weekends in a row, citing low tide and high stress. Meanwhile, I quietly documented soil readings and water levels, taking photos every 6 hours to complete the maintenance record. It was all part of the plan. If they wanted a lake that obeyed their aesthetic rules, they'd have to experience what happened when the lake obeyed real ecological rules instead. The first real crack in the HOA's armor came during a community town hall meeting hastily organized by Karanet. Flyers went out the night before. Ron handed them out door to door like he was delivering subpoenas. The headline was dramatic enough to make people curious. Urgent lake crisis, attendance required. They set up rows of plastic chairs under the gazebo, passed out bottled water, and positioned 2 battery-powered fans in the corners. I stayed just far enough away to hear without being seen. Karanet began the meeting in full dramatic form, pacing slowly, making prolonged eye contact with every confused homeowner like she was revealing the plot of a thriller. She explained, in breathless detail, how the lake was being drained illegally by a rogue resident with a grudge. She claimed I had tampered with county water systems, endangered wildlife, and committed a crime against the very spirit of community. But then Ron cleared his throat and, with visible reluctance, held up a printed copy of the official permit Lupe had filed on my behalf. It had my name, a county stamp, and the maintenance dates highlighted in yellow. The crowd started murmuring. One man in the back asked why they hadn't been informed about the maintenance. Another woman asked why they built floating docks without checking the water rights first. The energy shifted. Karanet tried to recover by blaming a lack of communication, but the crowd had already tasted the truth. Sheila stormed off mid-meeting, muttering something about ruined paddle yoga classes. That night, a local news van showed up. A young reporter named Drew interviewed a few residents, all standing in ankle-deep mud with frustrated expressions. The segment aired under the headline HOA turns lake into puddle. Was it sabotage or science? They tried to get a comment from me, but I declined. I had no interest in the spotlight. The story was telling itself just fine. But Karanet wasn't ready to give up. 2 days later, I was served with a temporary restraining order alleging that my maintenance efforts were endangering protected wildlife. The document was filled with dramatic language and wild accusations. According to the filing, I had disrupted nesting habitats, introduced invasive weeds, and committed ecological terrorism. I called Lupe immediately. She read the paperwork twice and laughed so hard she nearly choked on her tea. She filed a countermotion the same day, including time-stamped drone footage that clearly showed HOA contractors dredging parts of the lake months earlier for their marina project, without permits, of course. The court date came quickly. Karanet arrived in full business attire with a binder as thick as a dictionary. She brought Ron and Sheila, who looked visibly uncomfortable being there. Lupe strolled in calmly with a slim folder and a USB drive. The judge was a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense tone and a visible dislike for theatrics. After 30 minutes of evidence, Lupe played the drone footage on the courtroom monitor. It showed bulldozers operating near the southern shoreline, massive concrete blocks being lowered into the water, and workers dumping bags of gravel directly into the lakebed. Karanet claimed the footage was fake. The judge paused, looked over her glasses, and asked her if she had any permits for the construction shown. She didn't. The restraining order was not only denied but followed by a court order to investigate the HOA for unlicensed lake development. Karanet's face turned gray. Ron rubbed his temples. Sheila let out a deep sigh and quietly asked Lupe if she could get a copy of the footage for her own record. By the time we left the courthouse, the news had already hit the local online forums. Silverthorne HOA faces environmental violation probe trended for 2 hours on regional Twitter. Memes followed shortly after. My favorite was a side-by-side of my kayaks being towed and Karanet wading through lake sludge, captioned with the words from kayak to crisis in 3 HOA meetings. As the legal tide turned, so did public opinion. People who had once nodded along with Karanet's regulations were now questioning everything. Why were HOA fees so high when half the amenities didn't work? Why were permits ignored while residents got fined for using the wrong mailbox paint? A few residents held informal meetings at a neighbor's garage, and soon a new group emerged, calling themselves the Lakeside Committee for Fair Access. They put up signs near the walking trail. They started a petition. They even invited me to speak, but I politely declined. My focus remained on completing the maintenance. Meanwhile, the water level continued its slow descent until it reached the final threshold outlined in the conservation protocol. Exposed stumps revealed nests of invasive snails. Mud traps showed evidence of erosion caused by boat overuse in shallow areas. I documented everything. This wasn't just about making a point anymore. It was becoming a case study in what happens when development outpaces responsibility. On the 5th day, I stood on my dock and looked out over what was now more of a wide, wet crater than a lake. Frogs chirped from muddy pools. Herons stalked along the newly exposed edges. It was ugly, raw, and honest. For the first time in months, I felt like the lake was breathing again. And for the first time ever, the HOA was gasping. Word of the lake's condition had spread beyond our little community. What began as a dispute between me and the HOA had transformed into something stranger, almost comical, like a reality show being written in real time by nature itself. Cars from other neighborhoods drove in just to gawk at the sunken docks and cracked lakebed. Some brought folding chairs and coolers and treated it like a mud-watching picnic. At one point, a couple even started flying a drone overhead to capture aerial shot. I waved at them. They waved back. One of them shouted down asking if this was performance art. I told him it was maintenance. He gave me a thumbs up like he didn't believe a word of it and kept filming anyway. The attention wasn't exactly welcome, but it did have an unexpected benefit. It turned public scrutiny directly on the HOA. The spectacle of a once charming lake transformed into what looked like an abandoned excavation site brought reporters back, and with them came tougher questions. Why had the HOA built structures without permits? Why had they towed private property off docks they didn't legally own? Why was the HOA president now avoiding interviews and declining all public comments? The answer, as it turned out, was because Karanet was unraveling. I heard through one of my neighbors that she had recently held an emergency HOA board meeting where she accused her fellow board members of conspiring against her. She claimed someone had sabotaged the floating patio anchors, even though video evidence showed it slowly sinking due to natural silt buildup. She demanded an investigation into how I had obtained classified county permits, only to be reminded that the documents were public records anyone could access. Ron apparently tried to stage a soft intervention, suggesting they take a step back and re-evaluate the lake policy. She responded by suspending him from the board. Sheila resigned the next day. By now, the HOA's authority was fracturing. Residents began openly defying their ridiculous lake rules. A teenager set up a sign that said "Welcome to Puddlefest" and hosted a mud soccer match near the old swimming dock. Two men in their 70s pulled lawn chairs into the shallows and fished for what they described as emotional closure. One even wore a shirt that said "Real men fish in craters." Someone else printed a batch of stickers with the phrase "drained but not defeated" and began selling them to curious tourists. I never asked for this circus, but I couldn't deny the irony of it all. The HOA wanted control and homogeneity. What they got instead was community rebellion and viral memes. The final straw for Karanet came in the form of a camera, specifically mine. I had set up motion-triggered wildlife cameras along the lake's edge to monitor for returning species and any unexpected visitors. What I didn't expect to capture was Karanet herself, sneaking into the maintenance zone in the dead of night. She wore black from head to toe, like a villain in a bad sitcom, and carried what looked like bolt cutters and a wrench. The footage showed her crouching next to one of my flow regulators, attempting to twist a valve shut. She slipped in the mud, lost her balance, and fell face-first into a puddle of lake sludge. She crawled up, dripping and furious, then turned and kicked the pump housing out of spite before hobbling away. The next morning, I reviewed the footage, blinked several times, and forwarded it to Lupe without saying a word. She called back laughing so hard I had to put her on speakerphone. We sent the footage to the county office to document attempted tampering. They responded by issuing a formal warning to the HOA about interference with regulated environmental equipment. I didn't even need to press charges. The footage itself went viral after someone leaked it to the local news. The segment was titled HOA President Caught Mud-Handed and included a slow-motion replay of her fall set to dramatic piano music. The clip was shared across social media and repurposed into GIFs, memes, and one very popular TikTok sound. Karen in the Crater became a local legend. That weekend, the HOA attempted a formal vote of confidence. Only 9 members showed up. 6 of them voted against her. 2 abstained. 1 wrote "Bring back the lake" in the margin. The vote effectively stripped Karenette of her title. She didn't go quietly. She showed up to the next community potluck screaming about betrayal and federal conspiracies before being gently escorted off the premises by 2 residents holding paper plates. She was last seen posting on neighborhood message boards warning of underground water cartels. Shortly after, a moving truck arrived at her house and by morning she was gone. With her departure, the HOA's stranglehold over the lake loosened. A temporary leadership committee formed, made up of actual residents who preferred enjoying the lake over regulating it. They invited me to a meeting, informal this time. We sat in a garage with lawn chairs and lemonade. They asked what they could do to help. I told them the best thing they could do was respect the lake's natural rhythm. It didn't need paddleboat brunches or floating patios. It just needed room to breathe, to recover, and to exist without constant interference. They agreed, and for once I felt like maybe something good had actually come from all this madness. As the week wrapped up, I finalized the lakebed restoration process. The sediment had been tested, the debris cleared, and the invasive species mapped. I documented every step and submitted the final report. Then, one quiet morning before dawn, I returned to the old valve shed and began restoring the lake's flow. It wasn't fast or dramatic. It was slow, deliberate, almost like the lake itself was deciding whether it wanted to return. Inch by inch, water crept back into its old borders, filling out the dry spaces like puzzle pieces being remembered. People noticed quickly. Kids cheered as puddles became ponds again. Fishermen set their chairs back at the edges. Someone played a trumpet near the water and called it a lake rebirth anthem. I didn't mind. This was the part I'd been waiting for. Not the chaos, not the headlines, but the quiet satisfaction of watching something heal. The lake was never gone. It was just waiting. And now that the noise had faded, it was finally time for it to come home. The lake came back in stages, the way a melody builds from silence. First the shallow ends filled, turning dusty banks into mirror surfaces again. Then the reeds returned upright, standing proud as if nothing had happened. Frogs croaked louder each night, fish darted in playful splashes near the docks, and birds nested along the shoreline like old friends returning from a long, uncertain journey. I sat on my porch through most of those early mornings just watching, not doing anything, not fixing or planning, just witnessing what peace looked like when it didn't need to shout. The same lake that had been turned into a battleground of rules and ridiculous restrictions was quietly reclaiming itself in perfect, wordless defiance. A week after the final valve adjustments, I hosted a small gathering. Nothing grand. Just a few neighbors, some lemonade, a cooler of sodas, a folding table with chips and sandwiches, and 2 brand-new kayaks tied to the dock. I had bought them for Walter, the retired Marine who'd once been yelled off the lake by HOA patrol for trying to use one of mine. He showed up with his daughter and grandkids, wearing a cap that said Lake Veteran and carrying a plastic duck float for the youngest. The kids ran down the newly restored dock laughing, and Walter just stood beside me, eyes glassy, saying nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone told me everything I needed to hear. People trickled in, more than I expected. Even some of the old guard who used to follow Karenet's every HOA memo like it was gospel showed up with cautious smiles and polite nods. They brought lawn chairs and pies and stories. For the first time in a long while, the conversation wasn't about rules or property lines or violations. It was about fishing, memories, water levels, and how nobody had expected a drained lake to become the thing that brought everyone together. At one point, a kid grabbed a stick, held it like a microphone, and pretended to be a news anchor reporting on the miraculous return of Silverthorne Cove. The crowd clapped and laughed like they were watching a real show. The event wrapped up just before sunset. As people packed their things and headed home, I walked down to the dock one last time. Walter was paddling slowly in his new kayak, cutting gentle lines across the smooth surface of the water. His youngest grandkid sat on the front like a lookout. The silhouette of them against the setting sun felt like the kind of picture you'd find on a postcard, except this one was real, earned, and entirely undesigned. I took a deep breath, not because I needed air, but because I wanted to hold on to that exact feeling for as long as possible. A few days later, the temporary HOA committee finalized the appointment of a new president. His name was Greg. He was a retired librarian with a calm voice, large glasses, and an allergy to drama. At his first meeting, he brought a list of proposals written in pencil and asked if anyone minded if he skipped the pledge to the HOA flag because it felt a little too intense. No one objected. In fact, someone offered to replace the flag with a wind chime instead. Greg also made one more announcement. He and the board had reviewed the conservation documents and reached out to Lupe. Together, they wanted to sign a co-management agreement that would formalize shared stewardship of the lake between the HOA and my environmental oversight. Not control, not dominance, just balance. I agreed. We shook hands over a table covered in lemonade stains and cookie crumbs. It was the best kind of treaty. Karenet never returned. Rumor had it she tried to sue a few neighbors for defamation after her Muddy Fall clip went viral, but no lawyer took her seriously. Word spread that she had moved to a gated community 3 towns over where drones were banned, loud pets were fined, and lawn gnomes were outlawed by city ordinance. Someone said she still wore her lake enforcement sash while watering her bushes. I didn't care. She had become a ghost of the past, a lesson wrapped in hubris and mosquito bite. The lake didn't speak her name anymore, and neither did I. Eventually, the memes faded. The news vans moved on. People stopped using the phrase puddle politics and began simply calling the lake what it always was. Silverthorne. No titles, no declarations, just water and land doing what they were meant to do. And me, I went back to my work. Consulting for nearby towns, helping ranches with water systems, writing environmental reports. But I also started something new. A blog. Just a small corner of the internet where I shared what happened. Not in a bitter or self-righteous way, but with humor, reflection, and a little quiet sarcasm. I called it Maintenance Mode. Within a few months, it had a modest following. People appreciated the absurdity of it all, but also the heart underneath it. Sometimes I'd get emails from readers asking for advice on how to deal with their own HOA nightmares. I'd tell them the truth. Start with patience. End with paperwork. And if that fails, drain the lake. Just not all at once. Spring arrived early the next year. Birds nested in the same trees. The fish were back. Even the paddle boats made a return, but this time they were shared freely, donated by a few neighbors who now understood that water didn't need walls to be enjoyed. On one quiet evening, a group of teenagers dragged a large wooden board to the shore and painted it with big blue letters. Welcome to Silverthorne Cove. Beneath it, in smaller print, they added a message that made me smile wider than I had in months. Respect the water. Respect each other. And no brunch barges without permission. I sat under the stars that night, letting the breeze roll off the water and ripple through the pines. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing guitar. Somewhere else, a dog barked at a frog. And across the lake, laughter echoed softly. It wasn't perfection, but it was peace. Hard-earned, ridiculous, beautiful peace. And it all began with 2 kayaks, a ridiculous sash, and a decision to let the water speak louder than the noise around it.